everyone, it's Patricia. Welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher podcast. We're finishing up a discussion this week that we started about 2 weeks ago regarding TPRS, or Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling. This is a teaching methodology that I started using in my Chinese classroom a little over half a year ago, and this was the first semester that I really kind of committed to it, put it into practice in earnest. And since we're coming up at the end of the semester, figured this would be a good time as any to kind of give some reflective remarks on it. There's been a lot of teachers, particularly Chinese teachers, who have heard about this, have had some hesitations about implementing it. I definitely had those reservations as well. And so that first half of the episode, back on episode 11, just has some, practical advice, practical remarks on, things like assessments and grading and classroom management and things of that nature, which I think would be interesting, if not helpful, to any sort of language teacher, but particularly Chinese language teachers, just because there's a lot of stuff about TPRS that tends to be a little quirky when it comes to using it with Chinese. But in the end, I think TPRS is really well suited for Chinese for a litany of reasons. And so you can kind of check out those details over here, but over there. But this week, I kind of wanted to focus more in on stuff that probably the majority of you listening out here would have a little more personal investment in, especially if you're someone who is a language learner, someone who is a heritage speaker of Chinese, trying to pick up Chinese again, or not. You do you. Or if you're someone who's has ever been in a language classroom. Let's just put it that way. Because the thing with TPRS is that the comparison that's often drawn with TPRS is what we call legacy methods, which is just a really broad, overarching term to describe, the way that world language has been taught traditionally. And really this can be a wide variety of things. But I mean, if you were to really, kind of describe it, if you've ever taken a vocabulary quiz, if you've ever memorized a dialogue, if you've ever had a dictation quiz, if you've ever had a 听写 for Chinese, oh man, memories. Those are all kind of like legacy methods of instruction. And so, one other thing that kind of sets TPRS apart from that is that a lot of legacy methods really focus in on what a student can output, whether that be stuff that you write or, presentations that you give or answers you give on a test. A lot of legacy methods tend to be very output focused. And TPRS is kind of the opposite of that. TPRS is very comprehension focused. Comprehensible input is kind of the name of the game when we're talking about TPRS. What that basically means is that the philosophy is that students will naturally output language once they've had enough comprehensible input, target language material coming at them that they hear and they see, that they understand, new words being contextualized, and as long as they have enough of that comprehensible input, the output will come out naturally. And the output that comes out will often be more natural sounding, more sophisticated, and be, less kind of like, here is a grammar phrase and I'm just plugging and playing words into it. It generally speaking, it capitalizes on the way that children or babies learn language. Because it's not as if you sit down babies for a grammar lecture and teach them grammar rules and stuff like that. No, they learn language because they hear the same words over and over again in different contexts, and their baby brains kind of pick up what those words mean. And then after they've heard it enough, they start using it themselves. Imperfectly at first, and then it gets more refined as it goes along. So it really kind of capitalizes on that phenomenon. But anyway, if this is sounding brand new to you, you shouldn't be surprised. I was not taught with TPRS methods. I did not become privy to these methods at all until I started teaching. And so I'd say that most people who are, around my age, maybe this is not limited to age, but most people I'd say, learn languages or study languages using these legacy methods. And legacy methods, there's nothing wrong with them. I think it's the accepted norm in most places, at least where it works. Generally speaking, legacy methods are one of those things that the more you pick at it, the more you realize that this actually is not how language should be learned. But if it works, no one's going to change it, right? Now, where does it work? At first glance, you'll see that legacy methods succeed without much challenge to them in places where students already possess students are largely self-motivated or high achieving, right? This is particularly evident in Chinese. because you'll see a lot of examples where like students are just really taught like lecture style in a way that is not super engaging, and requires a lot of effort and studying and kind of pain and suffering on the student's part. But for some reason, the students still kind of like manage to learn Chinese really well. And so you look at those student populations and you realize that those students are usually like, first of all, this happens a lot in like college classrooms. So that's your sample set, which is a totally different population than when you're dealing with like middle school. And even in like non-college, non-university settings, if you're looking at high schools, generally speaking, Chinese programs have by and large been rolled out to like, student populations that are a little higher achieving, a little more ambitious, blah, blah, blah. And so in those cases, you'll think that like, because those legacy methods are still being employed there, legacy methods work with students that are high achieving and don't work with students who are not high achieving. But what I notice is that, it's not that, it doesn't really depend on the aptitude of the student. Legacy methods work, I think, with students who already possess either an intrinsic or extrinsic drive to learn. And where legacy methods fail is that it does not motivate or inspire the students to learn unless you like add stuff to it. So what I mean by that is kind of like legacy methods in themselves, in order for students to have buy-in, the students need to come in already with a desire or like some sort of motivation to learn the language, because legacy methods in the pure teaching of the language itself, it does not encourage an increased level of student interest. Because to be honest, with legacy methods, there's nothing about memorizing a vocabulary list, unless you're like a super nerd, there's nothing about memorizing a vocabulary list or studying for a dictation quiz that is inherently fun or intriguing or engaging, right? So the method of delivering curriculum through legacy methods is not inherently engaging. And so in order to keep the student engaged, they need to have some sort of external or intrinsic sort of like, I want to learn Chinese because I want to learn Chinese. And so that being said, if you have a student who does not have those intrinsic or extrinsic motivators, and you're still using legacy methods, the way that you keep up interest is by adding stuff to it. So like that stuff that's not directly related to like language instruction. So this is like cultural things, like trips or whatever, or like, the charisma of a teacher, like all these extra things that don't directly have to do with how the student is learning the language in order to keep up interest. It's almost kind of like you're learning the language, it sucks, it's hard work, but here are some things that can distract you to keep you engaged as you go along. If you're coming into learning a language without those intrinsic or extrinsic motivators, those like side entertainment things are what keep you going. Which, if you think about it, on the teacher end of things, is super exhausting to even think about. At least it is for me, just because, again, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but like the idea of teaching quote unquote culture as a means to keep kids engaged is something that I have an issue with. But comprehension-based learning, by comparison, is propelled by students being able to understand what they hear and see. And that in itself, being able to understand, is a huge motivator in itself, right? It capitalizes on the motivation that stems from that ability to understand. And I think this is applicable to any age group, right? Whether you're an adult or you're a child or whatever, but I think it's particularly effective when it comes to teenagers. And teenagers are still in a place of their lives where, number one, they need to feel secure. And that security often has to come from someone else telling them that they're doing okay. So teenagers have a need for security, number one. But the second thing is that teenagers are still also at a place in their lives where they are still easily amazed by their own abilities, right? They're still easily impressed by themselves and what they can do. And that is a really cool and awesome thing. I'm contrasting this with like jaded, old, grumpy people like me who are just kind of like, you do a thing that's actually objectively pretty cool and impressive, but you're like, yeah, whatever. Well, someone else could do it better. Like we need to not do this, old people. Like we need to still continue to have that youthful spirit of being impressed by. Love what you do, guys. Be impressed by what you do, and don't sell yourself short. But anyway, teenagers have those two requirements. Number one, they need to feel secure. Number two, they still are capable of amazing themselves at by their own abilities. And comprehension-based learning really plugs into both those things. I used legacy methods for like 3 to 4 to 5, a long time, majority of my career. when I was teaching Chinese, really for one reason, and that was because that was the only thing I knew. That was how I was taught, and I saw success. I saw success in my classmates being taught by legacy methods, and I saw success in myself. And so I realized, obviously, again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why would I take something that has been used by so many teachers that are way smarter and more experienced than me? Why would I try to tinker with that? Who am I to do that? And so I used legacy methods for a long time, and I also realized that they didn't work. And I talk about this at length in episode 11. In all the ways, all the excruciating ways that I realized that this didn't work, in this like kind of relentless and yet insane sort of drive to kind of like, ramming my head against a wall to try to get these things to work, and like being constantly baffled as to why everything I knew to be true all of a sudden was not true. And so one of the biggest overarching criticisms I had when I tried to implement these legacy methods, and I got this feedback from like parents and to some extent students and to some extent the community, was that students' level of interest in Chinese was low. Which is a criticism that I used to be very frustrated with, because like when people like, that's, first of all, that's a super like low hanging fruit, that criticism, to be like, oh, like students will perform so much better if they're just interested in it. I was like, duh, I know, but like it's really hard to really implement that, right? And I'm not complaining at this point. I think, everyone knows that anyone learns a new thing best, no matter how it is, if they're interested. If they're not interested, they're not going to want to learn. Like, this is not rocket science. I don't need people to tell me this. I don't think any teacher needs anyone to tell them this. We all know. But it's a matter of implementation, and that implementation is very tricky. And you instantly see this when people are pressed for examples on how to make this material engaging or interesting to students. Because usually, especially when it comes to languages, it tends to be the same thing, right? You got to get them interested in the culture. You got to take them on a trip. You have to have them travel. You have to have them eat food and celebrate holidays and blah, blah, blah. Usually, like the typical ways that people suggest for increasing interest, often for world language, are pinned towards culture. And in my experience, this is very limiting, because not everyone is interested in culture. It's really kind of a gamble, because you can't, Chinese culture is great and all, and it's also not for everyone, right? Like no one is obligated to be interested and invested in any one culture. You can't have that expectation. So it's ineffective at best and problematic at worst, just because, again, the whole interest in culture, quote unquote, can oftentimes, when done, poorly or done carelessly, can really, really just be kind of like selling kind of a romanticized, fetishized version of the culture to the student in an effort to kind of keep them interested. And that really speaks poorly to the authenticity of the culture that you're peddling to the students. And so, there's a lot of risk inherent in that. And it's not a risk that culture vis-a-vis language study is super important to me, too important for me to kind of cheapen the process in order to keep kids entertained. And so I tread very carefully when you use culture as a justification to keep kids interested in language, because there are so many ways you could really do some active harm, just in an effort to make sure that kids are paying attention so they can learn Chinese. And so, anyway, that being said, though, that seems like a very negative outlook, and I'll admit that my relationship with generating interest in Chinese in students was pretty unhealthy, and underdeveloped. Number one, because I was just totally turned off to the idea of using culture as a prop to stir up interest, but also because I kind of had this sort of drill instructor approach to learning Chinese because of my own experiences, right? Kind of if you come in with a pre-existing interest in Chinese, awesome, right? I know you already have an interest, and that is what's going to propel you to work hard. I don't need to do any work, right? You know you want to learn Chinese. If you want to learn Chinese that much, you're going to work hard to do it. I shouldn't have to push you even more, right? But if you're not interested in learning Chinese and you're still here for whatever reason, right? Obviously, it's not going to be any sort of interest that keeps you propelled. But what should keep you propelled to learn? It should be the moral obligation and responsibility you have to yourself, the Chinese people to your teacher to do what? Like, this is, oh man, it's super elite, it's super messed up. Kind of had this idea that like if you're not intrinsically motivated to learn Chinese, okay, fine, sure, whatever, can't help you with that. But you are morally obligated to try your best anyway, because it's your job as a student. If that ain't the most Chinese sort of philosophy towards things, I don't know what is. But I definitely had this kind of, it feels somewhat defeatist if you think about it, right? Because what that does is that kind of absolves me of the teacher of any responsibility to kind of motivate kids to learn. And if you view a teacher as a coach, right? Or if you view a teacher as someone who inspires children, which is something that I mentioned a couple episodes back, episode 7, when I talk about, teachers being someone who teaching being magic and your job being to share that magic, sharing your own experiences in learning something with your students and them being inspired by that. This is a totally incorrect approach to literally anything. And for me, the reason why I had this was really because, again, learning Chinese for me was hard. It was existentially very challenging. And I think I was really projecting a lot of that onto my kids. And so that all sounds pretty bad. But to my credit, I don't think I'm the only teacher who has or has had this line of thinking. I think the emphasis / discussion on interest is far more central to language learning than it is for other subjects because, at least in the US, right, being multilingual is a choice. No one questions whether you need to learn English or math or science. You just do. And so when there's this pre-existing expectation that you need to learn this subject, whether or not you're interested in it, the above line of thinking applies just fine, actually, right? The idea that like if you don't like math, well, guess what? You still have to learn math because it's important. Like you as a student, you're morally obligated to take the course seriously. Like all those things that I just said that were kind of horrible. We actually apply that to most other subjects because those are subjects that, again, are so integral to being what we consider an educated person in the US or in most monolingual cultures. That we don't really question, interest is kind of something that like, well, if you're interested in it, that's awesome. If you're not, suck it up and deal. But with languages, because again, this applies when you are in a culture and a society that where monolingualism is the norm. Being able to speak or being able to learn another language is kind of a bonus, right? And so you really do need some sort of external. The interest is a prerequisite to you learning. Right. So unless there's this external motivator to learn a language, right, which actually for the record does exist, right? That being, if your parents are forcing you to take it, or if there's only one language offered at your school and you need to take that language to graduate, it's a losing battle to get kids to learn a second language without meaningfully establishing interest first. So I just want to make that super clear because, again, the whole like interest discussion really comes to a head with in some subjects, but not others, right? Core subjects, not as much because we already take for granted that those are things that everyone has to learn. But for like languages and to some extent, the arts, music, things like that, even sports, physical education, are all things that people will be like, oh, well, if you're interested in it, then you work. If you're not interested, well, you don't need to learn it. So if you have the expectation for kids to learn it, they need to be interested in it first. And so there is this somewhat undue burden to establish interest in a field that, to be honest, I mean, in an ever increasingly globalized world, like being multilingual should be a priority. I mean, come on. I mean, I'm not saying this as a multilingual person being an elitist, but I'm just like literally most other countries, at least like almost all non-English speaking countries, have an expectation that English is like a core necessity to being an interesting, an educated person. And we just happen to live in a country where we already know English. And so somehow that absolves us of any responsibility to, I don't know, expand our worldview a little bit. Come on. All right. But anyway, that being said, interest level and the nature of that interest really varies greatly between students, right? Everyone's goals to learning a language, if they even have one to begin with, is different. But the one motivating factor, regardless of their interest, whether they have one or not, The one, and I mentioned this in the last episode, the one thing that keeps people going, keeps people wanting to learn, keeps people motivated is the feeling of success. That is the same for any student at any skill level, at any aptitude level. If you can get a kid to feel successful, if you can give them tangible evidence of that success, of improvement, that will be more powerful to keeping them motivated to learn than like any sort of, sideshow sort of culture add-on that you can have that may or may not capture their interest. If you can get them to feel like they're succeeding, you can really get them to feel like to be invested in anything. And so, I don't know. You can make some arguments about that are against that are legitimate, but in my experience, the power of having students feel successful and feeling that they can do it and feeling that they get it is really, really, really powerful. And so it makes sense to capitalize on that, and TPRS capitalizes on that. So anyway, I feel like, again, if you're someone who's just like, I don't understand why we need to go to so much trouble to do this TPRS thing, to push this in classrooms when legacy methods have worked just fine. I think, there's a couple things you would have to consider. Number one, if legacy methods are working, is it only working because you just happen to be settling in the right population, right? Are you just happening to be lucky enough to be working with students who are self-motivated or have some sort of extrinsic motivation factor, where legacy methods where classroom instruction does not have to be the root of their interest? And if you're like, no, I still have students who aren't self-motivated and legacy methods are working fine. Well, then what are you doing to keep their interest? What is keeping them? Like, is it really working out for you? Because it hasn't been working out for me. And so that's what I would ask. And the other thing is like, if you're a self-learner and you're like me and you're saying, well, I suffered through legacy methods and endless 听写and vocabulary quizzes to learn a language, and I don't understand why people are trying to take the easy way out now. One thing I mentioned in the last episode is that accessibility towards a language, is particularly for Chinese, is really important. Because Chinese, as a Chinese language learner myself, I understand that because the Chinese language learning world is still relatively small and there's a lot of junk that sort of creeps in that claims to teach Chinese but really doesn't. And so we're very protective of our space. But that protectionism shouldn't translate into elitism. And we should really work hard to try to expand that circle in whatever ways possible. Because again, it turns into an equity issue. Chinese is again seen as the language of business. A lot of people learn Chinese because they want to make more money. Let's just be blunt about it. And so it doesn't feel right to close off opportunities for people to learn this language and therefore get themselves to a higher station in life just because we're gatekeeping people. And so I'm all for methodology that makes something that is inaccessible more accessible to people. And I think TPRS does keep language learning, even a language that is as challenging and intimidating as Chinese, to be accessible to students of all intellectual abilities and all, interest levels and stuff like that. So anyway, if you are a self-learner of Chinese at this point and you're like, man, this TPRS thing sounds really, really cool. How can I implement those same methods? I think one thing that is a little bit discouraging maybe is that TPRS does tend to be very teacher-centric. You can kind of see why in the examples that I, outlined in the last episode on this. You can definitely do TPRS as a classroom of one. If you have a personal tutor, you can do TPRS one-on-one. But having a constant dynamic source for that comprehensible input that's coming to you, which oftentimes needs to come in the form of an actual live human being, that is central to TPRS. That being said, YouTube, in the absence of like a real live human being, is a great alternative for this. Dai Neubauer, which is one of the teachers I mentioned in the last episode, one of the 大师 of Chinese TPRS, she posts a lot of videos of stories that she's written for TPRS that she uses in her classroom, that she reads out loud, so you can have that oral input as well as the visual input as well. And so I highly recommend those. Mandarin Companion is a website that sells novels and short stories that are graded readers for TPRS that also follow that same approach. Terry Waltz also has written a couple of books that are suited towards TPRS, mostly for classroom usage, but I think you can use this for individual study as well. So, despite how teacher-centric TPRS can be, I think I would have a hard time. I think I've seen a couple of I think Hit Chinese is one YouTube channel / I think they have an Instagram as well that does TPRS style, CI style teaching, with what feels like a virtual teacher. I think that is effective, but it has its limitations. But I think with TPRS, the magic really is in having a teacher and, most ideally having a classroom of like-minded peers to kind of make that a sort of like a community learning experience as well. So, but really, I think taking apart, setting aside the nitty gritty of what a classroom looks like and what the methodologies actually are, I think what makes TPRS work, again, like I keep saying over and over again, is how it motivates students through capitalizing on the dopamine rush you get when you get it, like when you understand. And so if you're self-learning, right, if that is the secret to what actually makes TPRS work, that drive you get when you understand it, when you find success, if you're self-learning, what I would do is I would chase after the things that can produce that feeling and those successful results. And depending on your level, this might look like drastically different things. One thing that I'm still trying to work out is how TPRS might work for heritage speakers, which is a problem I kind of pointed out at the very beginning, because heritage speakers grew up in family environments where they had a ton of, oral comprehensible input. But despite having that large volume of comprehensible input, they struggle with output. So like the metaphor I gave about the glass, a language learner being a glass, and as long as you fill up the glass, continuously with water, the glass will eventually overflow on its own. For some reason, for heritage speakers, the glass isn't overflowing, right? I think to some extent, there are some elements of TPRS that will work really well for heritage speakers, particularly with cold character reading, which is something I talked about at length in the last episode on this. I talked about how when I was little and I traveled to Taiwan, couldn't read any Chinese at all, really. But I learned to recognize some high frequency characters, and only high frequency characters, because I watched so much TV with Chinese subtitles. And so over time, I was able to match up what I was hearing on TV with the subtitles at the bottom of the screen. And that's how I learned how to read some characters without ever having seen a vocabulary list. So I can speak from personal experience from learning Chinese that cold character reading works for heritage speakers. And a lot of people think that the largest obstacle that heritage speakers have is with reading and writing. I don't deny that that is true, because reading and writing in Chinese particular is just hard. But I think with heritage speakers, it's really more, the problem is really more with being reluctant to speak. So being able to understand and not being able to output. There's an article by Stephen Krashen, who's also a linguist and expert on second language acquisition, and he describes this phenomenon as being called language shyness. I'll link the article in the show notes. It's a really good one. It basically says that because heritage speakers tend to be in the same social circles as native speakers, and native speakers feel like that they can communicate with them to some extent in the native language, the mistakes that heritage speakers are making seem a lot more obvious and salient than it would had it be coming from a non-heritage speaker, right? It's kind of this phenomenon that there's a social component to this, right? If you're part of the in-group, but you're missing or you're, deficient in a certain marker of being a part of that in-group, the mistakes you make, that deficiency becomes a lot more obvious when you're in that in-group. There's again, if you could describe this as being classic example, right? Like you're Chinese American, and then you get criticized by family members or whatever because you're you're Chinese. People expect you to speak Chinese, and yet you can't speak Chinese. I mean, hopefully that resonates with some of you, because that's something I definitely felt when I was growing up. And so the thing is, that social dynamic not only creates internal pressure within the heritage speaker, because they already feel deficient, working out this conflict of being part of the in-group, but also missing an integral part of being part of the in-group. But also when you're in those circles, native speakers, for whatever reason, feel much more at liberty to correct you or make fun of you for your mistakes. Again, it comes down to it becomes an existential identity sort of emotional sort of issue, right? It's an emotional social barrier that comes up with heritage speakers. And so if if you're not, and the thing is, what's ironic about this is that like with heritage speakers are people like who grow up speaking a language at home, but at school or at work, their main language is what they speak there, and so their heritage language ends up being poorer in quality and proficiency than their inherited language. So for instance, again, if you're Chinese American, your parents are immigrants from China or Chinese-speaking country. Your parents speak Chinese to you at home. You speak back to them in English because you're used to speaking in English, because that's why you speak for most of your waking hours, because you speak English at school or at work. And so you kind of end up being in this weird limbo where like you can understand parts of the language, but you can't speak it. And with Chinese, it often results in you not being able to read or write it as well. And so, again, it's a complicated emotional, cultural, whatever, sociological space to be in. But the net result of that is what Krashen calls this like language shyness, right? And this language shyness is born out of really like having your deficiencies placed in a very negative light, which therefore like doesn't encourage you to speak up more and practice more, because any language, even your mother tongue, even your native language requires practice to get good at it. So like all the criticism, all the existential angst and conflict and complicated situations you have surrounding this language only discourages you and makes you speak less out of a fear of being wrong, out of a fear of being ridiculed or corrected, because no one likes any of those things, right? The only cases in which I feel like you'd be okay with being corrected in your language is if you already feel really secure in your learning of that language already. And heritage speakers oftentimes, I don't know, security is not really the word I'd associate to my Chinese abilities before I started learning it formally. Like again, as a heritage speaker myself, like this vicious cycle of like being, trying to speak your language, being called out for being wrong, and then like wanting to speak it less and less so you get worse and worse. It's a vicious cycle. I myself have firsthand experienced it. It sucks. And, the only time in which that vicious cycle for me was broken and the only time where I was able to step out of that language shyness was when I was put in an immersive environment, when I was like literally in Taiwan, signed a language contract, could only speak Chinese while I was in the classroom building. And, my every day for like 2 months was being surrounded with people who I could not speak English to. There was that. So there's kind of like this like a survival instinct where it's kind of like there is no, you cannot be shy, otherwise you're not going to be able to survive, as well as being in a highly supportive classroom environment as well. It was tough at ICLP. But it was a small class. There were other Asian American, Chinese American kids in my class who had a similar background as me, and our teacher was super nice and super awesome and so supportive. And so that nice intersection of really positive environments, really encouraging environments helped break that language shyness in me. But anyway, when we're talking, obviously that really graceful, elegant intersection of events does not happen for everyone. And you really do have to seek out those opportunities and invest time and money into it. And so the question still stands, right? If TPRS, if the value in TPRS is increasing accessibility of language to all people, that should include heritage speakers. And so how do we make TPRS work for heritage speakers, capitalize on the strengths of heritage speakers, but also really, hone in on their weaknesses and their challenges? So in looking for solutions of this, it's not a subject of immediate concern for me because I don't have heritage speakers in my classes, despite myself being one, but I definitely will. If I move to another school, I definitely will have heritage speakers in the future. Mike Peto's blog, he's a Spanish teacher. I think he also teaches French. Maybe he just teaches Spanish. I don't remember. But he has he's written extensively on teaching Spanish to Spanish heritage speakers, which I found to be very, very useful and interesting. And he kind of boils down his approach for heritage speakers to 3 things. So he focuses on, number 1, reading. Number 2, developing interest in the heritage / Spanish speaking world. And number 3, to expose them to the diversity of dialects in Spanish, of which there are a lot. I found all 3 points to be equally as salient for Chinese. Even that last one. Even though when we're talking about like strictly Mandarin, I'm not talking about like dialects of Chinese, which are largely mutually unintelligible. I'm talking about like regional accents for Mandarin. I find that last point about exposing heritage speakers to different dialects, or in the case of Mandarin, different accents, different regionalisms, still is very applicable, because when we're talking about regional variations with Mandarin, we're talking about things like vocabulary choices or semantic habits, or even like different writing systems, the obvious being like simplified versus traditional. That last point, again, strikes me as being very interesting, particularly as someone who is Taiwanese American, as someone who chose to learn traditional characters rather than simplified characters while I was studying. I feel like Taiwanese American heritage learners often get thrown under the bus on that last point, because most classrooms, at least in the US, are taught by teachers from China. And so the classroom norms are geared towards simplified writing, simplified characters, and mainland style vocabulary, mainland style grammar. Textbooks oftentimes, have lots of, like, first thing you learn in like one of the most used textbooks for Chinese is 你家住在哪儿? The nar thing comes up right away. You don't say that in Taiwan, like almost ever. A lot of things like that, right? And so that strikes Taiwanese Americans who basically grew up hearing another version of Mandarin as being, what they hear. They're at a marked disadvantage, because they can rely less on what they already know, because the version of Mandarin that they're learning is not aligned with their heritage, what they inherited as what is Mandarin. And so as a result, what you're learning in Chinese class, despite it being your heritage language, still feels incredibly foreign. I fully empathize with that frustration. And, I was also corrected for not being able to 支持诗 properly. I was implored by professors to like switch over to learning simplified rather than traditional characters, things like that. And so, the cognitive sort of challenge with that as a Taiwanese American learning Chinese in a mainland centric classroom is that, your norm is no longer the norm, and you're kind of like strong armed into conforming into a norm that is not your norm. And so your heritage language really feels more like a foreign language at that point. So I fully empathize with that frustration. And I will always advocate for, actually I'll talk about that later on, but I fully emphasize because I went through that as well. But on the same page, something that I always say and I always think is knowing more stuff is better than knowing less stuff. And I still think, despite the fact that like mainland, China-centric classrooms feel, put Taiwanese American students, heritage speaker students at somewhat of a disadvantage, I think it's necessary for Taiwanese American students who are actively pursuing Chinese studies and are somewhat invested to also understand the quote unquote other side of things, right? Just because you're Taiwanese American doesn't mean that you can exempt yourself from being able to read simplified characters, or knowing of alternate like mainland Chinese vocabulary, or like how mainland Chinese people speak, if only because Taiwanese native speakers also know those things. The only difference is that they learned it through, like, they didn't have to study it. They learned it through like watching TV and browsing the internet. And so I'd say to like Taiwanese American students of Chinese that it's still worth your while to be able to read simplified characters, to understand like, the semantic and lexical quirks of the mainland variations of Chinese. I don't think I did enough of this when I was studying. Part of it is because I studied most of my Chinese in Taiwan, but something happens when I like hear mainland Chinese speak. When I hear Taiwanese people speak Chinese, it feels very much like a native language to me. Like my brain has to work not as hard to understand. It feels very natural. When I talk and listen to mainland Chinese people speak, it does feel a little bit like I'm listening to a language that I learned as a totally new second language, which I understand why that happens. And I kind of wish that that gap didn't exist because it makes my brain work harder. And it doesn't make sense to me. Well, it does make sense, but it's frustrating that like they're both Mandarin, but one I can understand far more easily than the other. And I feel like the reason why I can't understand the one as much as the other is really as a matter of exposure. And so that's something that I'm actively working on, is being able to be more natively comprehending of mainland Chinese style Mandarin. At the same time, though, I think one thing that might strike as being problematic, my asking Taiwanese American students to still learn mainland Chinese Mandarin, is when heritage speaker students of mainland Chinese backgrounds aren't held to those same expectations, right? Because their Chinese classroom led by a mainland Chinese teacher matches up perfectly with what they already learned at home. And so, that gives them an advantage, first of all. And second of all, because the majority culture is so it's so clear what the majority culture is, what the norm is. There is very little impetus or necessity in students with a mainland Chinese background for them to learn the quote unquote other side of things. And this becomes problematic on like a practical scale. I still remember like when I took a classical Chinese course in college, and almost all my classmates could only read or were primarily used to reading simplified characters. The thing with classical Chinese is that you can't really read classical Chinese in simplified characters. You can, but it's like it's a little bit like trying to read Shakespeare but in chat speak. I feel like that's kind of like a not so gracious description, but it's not, you can't really. And so like, from a practical perspective, if you limit yourself to only like, that one side of things, you end up running into issues later on a practical level. I don't know if there is a similar like privilege / power imbalance play in other languages where some dialects, some versions of the language are seen as the norm and others are kind of like, you don't actually have to learn that. Like I get that with like a lot of Taiwanese style Mandarin, a lot of like mainland centric, China centric classrooms are kind of like, that's what they use in Taiwan. You don't ever have to learn that. They're not relevant. And I'm just like, who are you to say that an entire one entire people group's version of the norm is not relevant just because there's a fewer amount of people that use it? I think that's a little unfair. But I think that same, it's good to be conscientious of that the argument between which should you learn, simplified or traditional characters, is something that I feel is a little overemphasized as a discussion / debate in the Chinese speaking world, because my philosophy is always you should learn both. Why? Because native Chinese speakers know both, right? They might like know how to write one better than the other, but it's not as if like people who are from mainland China suddenly become illiterate when they see traditional Chinese characters. But you'll see tons of people who like study Chinese as a second language and they never looked at traditional characters and only study simplified characters. You give them like characters in traditional and they'll be like, I can't read this. Why is that? That shouldn't be happening. And so, that's why I'm a strong believer in teaching both simplified and traditional characters. For on the one hand, it just makes pedagogical sense to me. The two are just so similar anyway that teaching both isn't that huge of a leap. But on a philosophical level, like if you choose one over the other, you're already deciding for students what is the dominant or more important people group within the Chinese speaking world. And that's a really like dangerous line to be walking on. Don't want to get into politics here about that, but I think it's something that's really worth considering. If you are only choosing to instruct your students in simplified characters or even, in traditional characters, and maybe this can swing both ways as well, you are implicitly telling your students one side of things is more important, more relevant than the other, and that is not right. And so, anyway, just a PSA, just my soapbox moment. How might TPRS change how we view language learning as a whole? I think the discussion on heritage speakers, I think that remains particularly salient because the core of TPRS has to do with, particularly when you're talking about students of all abilities, of all who are coming to the language in different places emotionally and socially and, existentially. TPRS really capitalizes on students feeling like they have succeeded. And so as long as you keep that at its core, TPRS will work. But even outside of TPRS, even if you're not utilizing TPRS methodologies, whether it's because you prefer legacy methods, because that's what works, and if that's the case, hey, all the more power to you. Awesome. You're probably working, probably creating less work for yourself, which is I am all for that. But if you're a self-learner as well, right, and TPRS is not necessarily applicable, or you're just really far along on your language journey and TPRS is not something that really fits with your current field of study or place in your studies, I think what TPRS opens up is a greater discussion on maintaining interest and engagement in the language classroom, because like I mentioned before, maintaining interest or even sparking that interest is so crucial in the language classroom because it precedes all else, whether you like it or not. Again, like looking back to what we talked about before about how in other subjects, if you're not interested in science, too bad, you still have to learn it. That assumption doesn't apply to languages if you're in a monolinguistic culture. And so it's kind of like you can't expect students to want to learn a language unless you first establish interest in them first. And one of my biggest mistakes when I started teaching was downplaying the importance of establishing that interest. And in doing so, it made both me and my students really miserable. I downplayed it because I was really turned off by how people typically define interest and engagement when it comes to Chinese and Chinese culture. Because, and this really depends on how like quote unquote woke your community is, or really just how worldly they are and how much they've traveled. It really, sometimes it comes down to like economic privilege, to be honest. But a lot of the times when you're talking about really any language and you're building students' interest off of like, you're banking on their interest in the culture to draw them into learning the language. I downplayed it because I was really turned off by how people typically define interest and engagement when it comes to Chinese culture. Because so much of that interest and engagement, when you don't really look into the nuances enough, and you're just kind of like, I gotta throw some culture in there somewhere, you end up, like giving people a very sanitized, somewhat exoticized, and fetishized even like version of China that isn't rooted in reality and that plays directly into the hands of like, the West's, historical fascination with the Orient. And I have a really hard time swallowing that. The idea that like, a lot of the times when you're just trying to like teach a part of traditional Chinese culture, it's people who have not had any context for that, despite apart from what they have seen in, books and outdated movies and media, they try to contextualize that in a version of China that doesn't really exist. And there's a lot of undoing that needs to be done with that. And so I knew of that possibility, and I'd seen like tangible signs of that in especially some of my younger students who just, have the unfortunate circumstance of being, like shown really simplified versions of what real China is like, real Chinese history is like, because that's just how we process things that are different from us. We try to like flatten it as much as possible so it makes it easier for our brains to wrap around it. And oftentimes those flattened images are not true to reality. And so knowing how thorny of an issue that was, knowing how difficult and how challenging it was, I just really didn't want to touch culture like at all. And in part because I just really didn't buy into the idea that culture was the end-all be-all of keeping kids engaged. Like, I just really think it's very foolhardy to think that as long as you show people how cool Chinese culture is, then they will instantly be attracted to it. I mean, I'm ethnically Chinese. I don't think Chinese culture is like all that interesting, and I have a degree in it, right? The reasons why I learned Chinese are extrinsic to my fascination with Chinese culture and history. So even as a person with like an East Asian studies major who concentrated in Chinese history and politics, I don't love Chinese culture to that extent. I really feel like a lot of the times you really have to be very careful when someone loves to learn a language because you really have to think hard about what exactly is your picture of that culture. Is it really rooted in reality? I also had an issue with like the utilitarian interest in learning Chinese, like the whole like I want to do business in China when I'm older sort of interest, because number one, that does feel a little bit like it feels utilitarian, like it feels like the means to an end, a means to an end of achieving your capitalistic interests. But on the other hand, it's like you burn out on that reasoning, right? If you see studying a language as a means to an end, that ends really needs to be worth your while while. Otherwise, you're going to burn out and you're not going to see that it's worth it, or you'll get bored, right? I think older learners of Chinese, no matter the level, would do well to keep all of that in mind, right? It's good that many people who are learning Chinese independently are intrinsically motivated and have their own individual reasons for wanting to learn. But regardless of where you're coming from, right? Even if it's as a reason as noble as like something I've heard where a lot of people will say, I'm Chinese American, I'm learning Chinese later on in life, but I'm realizing only now how important it is to my identity, how important it is to communicate to my family, so on and so forth. That is as noble a reason as any. But a lot of the times that ideological reason, it will not be enough to keep you going through like, the just pure suckiness of learning a language sometimes. What if you decide that like, talking to your family isn't worth the trouble? What if you get really busy? Things like that, right? And so as good as it is to have an intrinsic motivator to learn, I would say that one thing that has kept even the most fickle and difficult to motivate students that I've had is the idea of seeking that success, tangible signs that you are making progress. And so I'd say, yes, keep your ideological goals. If you want to work in China, yes, by all means, work hard to learn Chinese so you can do that. If you want to connect with your culture, yes, by all means, use that as your run towards that goal. But I think at the same time, what will keep you going in the process are those tangible signs that you are doing okay, that you are feeling secure because you have succeeded before. So seek out opportunities to find those signs of success. How can you find those signs of success? Find people to practice with. Find language partners who can tell you how good of a job you're doing, right? Otherwise, you're just going to doubt yourself. One other thing is you can watch Chinese TV shows without English subtitles. You'll be surprised at what you can learn, what you know already, and that is really encouraging in itself. If you're a heritage speaker, be aware of that language shyness that is inherent in all of us and make peace with it, right? And then once you have, put yourself in situations where you can challenge yourself to see the fruits of your work, to employ what you already know, and then to be in a place where you can be secure in what you know and be proud of what you know, right? Because, it's unfair to expect, every immigrant kid to be magically bilingual. Realize that you already have, more than you think, and you should give yourself credit for that. There should not be you should not put an expectation on yourself to be magically bilingual just because you happen to grow up in an immigrant household. That's not fair. No other group is held to that same standard. Give yourself a break. And so once you've given yourself a break, you'll feel more at liberty to ask questions, and to seek out correction, and to at a certain point to produce speech of your own. Don't feel pressure to start speaking right away, but make comprehension your goal. A lot of the times that language shyness also comes from a lack of vocabulary. And so just by the act of increasing vocabulary, watching TV shows, watching YouTube videos that help you broaden your vocabulary will help you feel more secure. Don't be afraid to ask when you don't know something. And then when you feel comfortable, try it out. You will know when that feeling comes. You'll know when it feels right to start speaking on your own. I always tell my students that they know far more than they think, and you should always be ready to surprise yourself. So, all right. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this very long-winded discussion on a topic that, at first glance might just only be helpful to people who teach in classrooms, but hopefully will be interesting and helpful to anyone who learns a language. Let me know if you like this. I feel like a lot of teacher podcasts really go strong on the classroom teaching stuff, and I rely on that. I rely on podcasts like that to really improve my teaching, so I see the inherent value in that, but I also recognize that a lot of you who are listening to this podcast are not teachers, and that's totally fine. Love that too. But if you find this kind of thing interesting, let me know. If you don't, let me know. You know how you can let me know? You can connect with us on social media. If you are on Twitter, you can find us at Bad Chinese Pod. If you're on Instagram, at Bad Chinese Teacher. And on Facebook, just search us up, Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. If you're looking for me, you can find me on Instagram at Patricia Liu, on Twitter at Patricia SQ Liu, and you can find my latest writing at my blog, blog.patricialiu.net. Show notes for this episode, as well as all previous episodes, can be found at the podcast website, which is badchineseteacher.com. And last but not least, if you are loving what you are hearing, I'd love to hear actual feedback from you in the form of a review on Apple Podcasts. If you're an Apple Podcast user already, again, just hop down to where it says the show name, tap on it, and leave a review at the very bottom. And while you're at it, hey, 5-star rating would be nice too. So thank you for joining me across this holiday break. and for making me a part of your lives. Really appreciate it. It's a busy season for us all. By the time this episode is posted, I will have, hopefully, please, God, please, we'll have submitted my grad school applications, and so hopefully that part of hellish nightmarishness will be over in my life. For those of you who are still in the midst of that, all the more power to you. Been there. Yeah. So, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.